Hi, welcome to the annual Careers in Journalism and New Media night, which is normally at Kelly Writer's house, but now is in the virtual Kelly Writer's house. We are coming to you from Philadelphia, New York, New England, Asia. We're from all over the place. My name is Stephen Freed. I'm always the moderator for this, and what we do every year is we bring amazing Penn alums who are doing great in the media, and usually they are people who've won the Nora Magid Mentorship Prize, which I'm about to tell you about, and to talk about what you can be doing to, as undergrads, to get ready to join the media. And of course, this effort is also open to people who've already graduated, who are still trying to find their way in the media. And so when we open it up to questions, you'll be able to ask about all those kinds of things. When I was at Penn, there was very little nonfiction writing training, and the idea that you went into media meant that you were abusing your parents' money that you spent to go to Penn. What's nice about Penn now is that it very much encourages nonfiction writing. It has a journalism minor, and the Nora Prize and the journalism minor together, and wonderful nonfiction courses taught by journalists have really made the world a different place at Penn for all different kinds of journalism and media. So I first want to introduce our panelists, who hopefully you're seeing on the right. These people are all previous winners of the Nora Magid Mentorship Prize. We have Ashley Parker, class of '05, who's at the Washington Post and MSNBC. We have Matt FLEGENHEIMER, who's class of '11, who's at the New York Times. We have Jess Goodman, class of '12, who is at Cosmopolitan and is also a first-time author. Jess is also a board member on the Nora Prize now. And we have one of our youngest winners, Rebecca Tan, who won in 2019, who is a reporter at the Washington Post. I'm Stephen Freed. I graduated in 1979 before your parents were born. And I was a magazine writer for a long time. I now write nonfiction books, mostly history books, and I teach at Penn and I teach at Columbia. And I would be remiss if I did not show the book cover. So we have not had a Nora Prize winner yet who had a big national book release, but Jess Goodman's first book, a young adult novel, came out in August. It's called They Wish They Were Us, and she will talk about it and talk about what it's like being an author, a first-time author in any place, but certainly in the world of COVID. But I have now fulfilled my responsibility to show Jess's book cover at least once. And of course, go buy her book and read it and give it to all your teenage friends so that they don't apparently kill each other because it's got some blood in it. So let me tell you a little bit about the Nora Magid Mentorship Prize. The Nora Prize, this is Nora Magid. She was my teacher. She was, at the time in the 70s and 80s, the only nonfiction writing teacher at Penn who was interested in journalism. She died in 1991. And not long after, a group of her graduates who were in media all over the world raised money to create a prize that would offer mentorship to students when they were seniors and they weren't sure if they should be journalists, just like we weren't sure we should be journalists, and also offer mentorship. And then once the people had been mentored and had gotten on in their careers, they would mentor other people. And it's been quite inspiring, I must say, to see that the winners of the Nora Prize have become wonderful mentors themselves. And the prize is now $4,000 a year. Those who won the prize earlier are probably gasping at that. I saw Ashley's eyes shoot open. And that's to be used basically for anything the student wants to do for professional development. And what we found, interestingly, is that sometimes students need money to actually be a paid intern during the summer after their senior year, which didn't used to exist before, but is one of the realities of breaking into journalism. And so we're happy to give that prize, and we mentor not only through our own networks, but through the networks of people that we know. The prize is open to all seniors at Penn. Preference is given to those who expect to attempt to make careers in some form of media. And the application information you can find online. It's at the CPCW site. This is the address, and I will give it again later. And the deadline for entering is January 19th, 2021, which is, I can't believe we're in 2021. So now I'm going to turn off the sharing so you can see everybody. And I'm going to introduce our panel. I I don't know which order you're seeing them, but I'm seeing them from the right-hand corner. I'm seeing Ashley. Ashley Parker is are the earliest of our prize winners. She won the prize the second year we gave it out in 2005. She's a White House reporter for the Washington Post. She was part of the Post team that won a Pulitzer Prize for national reporting in 2018 for their coverage of Russian interference in the 2016 presidential election. She joined the Post in 2017 after 11 years at the New York Times, where she covered the 2012 and 2016 presidential campaigns and Congress, among other things. She's an MSNBC senior political analyst and has also written for the New York Times, Sunday Magazine, Glamour, Washingtonian, and other publications. Matt FLEGENHEIMER, who's on the other side of me and where I'm looking anyway, is class of 2011. He is a staff writer at the New York Times covering national politics. He started at the Times in 2011 on the Metro desk covering transit, city hall, and campaigns, and he's out doing enterprise reporting for the election, although I think he's doing most of it from the room that you're seeing him in. Jess Goodman, class of 2012, is the Indiebound best-selling author of the young adult novel They Wish They Were Us, which you may have seen not very long ago, which is out now from Razorbill PenguinTeen. She also has a second book in this series in the works, and I think she'll probably tell us that she has like some movie options and stuff too. So we'll be talking about that. She is, in her day job, she is the op-ed editor at Cosmopolitan magazine. And she and her team received the National Magazine Award for their 2017 story, How to Run for Office, which of course completely changed the 2018 election. So thank you to Cosmopolitan for doing that. Previously, she was digital news editor at Entertainment Weekly and an entertainment editor at HuffPost. Rebecca Tan. Rebecca, where are you?
Right now, I'm in Singapore, but usually I'm based in DC.
Okay.
Usually I'm in Capitol Hill.
Rebecca Tan is class of 19, is a writer and reporter at the Washington Post. She covers local government. In 2020, she has been writing about the coronavirus in DC metro area, focusing on the disproportionate impact on nursing homes and underserved communities. She was on the ground during historic protests in Washington following the killing of George Floyd and contributed to the Post's coverage, which was a finalist for the Pulitzer in breaking news reporting of the back-to-back mass shootings in El Paso, Texas, and Dayton, Ohio. She previously worked for Vox.com and in college wrote for and was the executive editor of the Daily Pennsylvanian. So this is a wonderful group spanning a really long time in journalism and doing national and local work. So, Rebecca is one of the people who's covering all the different aspects of how COVID is playing itself out in Maryland, in District of Columbia. Ashley and Matt are covering the nation. And what you should know, I mean, not everybody knows what the editorial editor of Cosmo is, but Cosmo a couple years ago decided to jump in the deep end and start writing more aggressive political opinion pieces and move Jess up to oversee them. So these women's magazines, which actually at the beginning of their lives were quite political and then stopped being political, are political again. And so Jess has a wonderful forum there for that. So I guess the without being partisan, the elephant in the room is how COVID is affecting journalism. So before we do what we normally do, which is talk about our backgrounds and our advice to people trying to get into journalism, I'd like to hear from each of you a little bit about how COVID has affected your lives, how it's affected your reporting, and how you think it's affecting our field. Anybody can go first. Or nobody can go first. Matt's going to go first because he moved his hand.
It's a lot harder to cover an election without a campaign trail. And I would ordinarily be out in the country at this point, both at political events and not at political events, talking to voters, telling the story of this election through people and places and sights and sounds that you encounter on the road. There has not been a lot of that, virtually none of that during this campaign. I really haven't traveled all that much since March. And doing the sort of longer enterprise stories that are a part of my beat for the 2020 coverage is really an exercise in phone calls and scene reconstruction and intellectual scoops, much more than observation and
what's an intellectual scoop? That's an interesting term.
There's a sort of conceptual scoop is another one. This might be a Times thing that Ashley rolls her eyes at, as I tend to. But it's this, in lieu of actual scoops, the Times likes to pride itself on, in addition to actual scoops, but this sort of thought being injected into the conversation that hasn't been there before, whether that comes through a longer form story or news analysis around a big news event. Anyway, there has been much less opportunity to travel, much less opportunity to do the sort of reporting that gives you a much better sense of where the pulse of the electorate is, frankly. And that's hard enough as it is, as we saw 4 years ago. But so COVID has radically altered how I've been able to approach the job this year, and will continue to in the next.
Do you have a personal COVID nightmare story?
Personal COVID nightmare story. My editor has a good saying these days. If somebody asks how she's doing, that she has no valid complaints. So I have no valid complaints. My medium complaints would be that stories tend to hold a lot longer, enterprise stories, when there is such a tsunami of news. This was true before COVID, but all manner of enormous national stories that we've seen in the last several months make it that much harder to land something with impact, with the sort of lead time that you need to do the work to make it good enough to land with impact. So there's been a lot of that. I think we've landed some with success this year, but it's that much harder to sort of plot out when you want something to land, and the sort of best laid plans tend to intervene these days.
So are you using phones more than Zoom, or what do you use for your interviews?
I'm using phones much. I've done a little Zoom. The phone is pretty good. I tend to do much more on the phone than video chats with people. A lot more. I mean, it's caused you to be more creative too, and I'm sure others can speak to this as well. But I find myself doing a lot more sort of C-SPAN archives and documents. That there's sort of more clip search, all the stuff that you would do anyway, but wouldn't necessarily occur to you first if you had the chance to go out and see people in the flesh. So it does generate a certain creativity out of necessity on some of these stories, but you'd certainly prefer to be able to travel in the way that we would.
You're not giving me a COVID nightmare.
I got to think about the COVID nightmare.
I can do 2 quick COVID nightmares.
Go ahead, Ashley. Thank you.
I'm going to stall and then listen to Ashley's.
Yeah, and then go back to Fleg. So one was they both involved my husband, one more than the other, who covers the White House for the Wall Street Journal. But one was right when COVID was happening. He went in as things were kind of shutting down and cases were just popping up around the country. He went and he interviewed a Republican official, and then basically got a call from the official that was like, we wanted to let you know before we put out this press release nationwide, but we think said official has coronavirus. And so we had to quarantine, obviously, which meant, I have a 9-year-old stepdaughter and I have an almost 2-year-old. And we have a nanny with another family for the 2-year-old. So we're incredibly lucky, but we had to send our nanny away while we quarantined, and that was a nightmare. So that's my first nightmare. It was like the worst week of my professional life. It was just pure misery. And then the second one is my husband had put in, I cover the White House, he covers the White House for the Wall Street Journal. When you put in an interview request for the president, we all have interview requests in, but the president's more likely to talk to the Journal than the Washington Post, and Mike had an interview request in. And all he said to the White House, he knows, we know they're disorganized, whatever. He knew this, and sort of hearing the back end, it was just like, I don't care, when the interview is, what day, whatever, all I want is more than 5 minutes notice. That was the only thing he asked for, right? He was like, I'm happy to come in alone. I'm happy to come in with a team. I don't care. I just want more than 5 minutes notice, right? And so it's a day in the middle of coronavirus, kind of deep in it. He's bearded and disheveled and unshowered. And he gets a call that's can you be at the White House in the next 20 minutes? And so he literally he has hasn't been following the news in the way you would want to be following the news to interview the president, isn't showered or shorn in the way to be interviewing the president. So he races into the shower, right? And then it's like, it's killing me because like, I want the interview. I don't actually want Mike to get the interview, but like as a supportive partner, I have to be like, okay, you go shower. Like I'm packing up your bag. I've got the record. So like I'm making him a backpack so he can go scoop me. And then it's like not safe for him to take an Uber. So I have to like drive him so he can like brainstorm questions again to scoop me in my publication with his colleagues and like drop him off at a White House interview. So that like I was really proud and happy of him, but like also nightmarish.
Did he get a good interview?
Yeah, it was pretty buzzy.
So it wasn't anything that you like had to apologize
like,
for that you drove him.
Right? Like good for my partner. Bad for me as a journalist.
This sounds like a Hepburn Tracy movie.
You guys need to write like some sort of rom-com about your lives.
Be like a dark comedy emphasis on it. But yeah.
Well, I mean, it's interesting, but so those sound like really bad nightmares that are partly because of childcare.
Yeah, I mean, yes, that everything is harder with children.
And are you doing everything from home, or are you physically going out and reporting?
We are mainly doing, so both the Post and the Journal, I assume the Times and most publications have been very family friendly and wonderful in this moment. And basically you do what you're comfortable with. But we have a pretty large germ pool just because we have our nanny and her family. We have the other little boy and his family and the nanny share. My stepdaughter is going back and forth between our house and her mom's house with her mom and her boyfriend. And then she's now in a school pod. And so basically, like for the comfort of everyone, there was a request early on that we like not go to the White House briefings, not travel, all that stuff that raises your risk. And so that's what we were doing. Now we're sort of, Mike just started, and I probably will too. He just took a trip on Air Force One. And so we're kind of traveling in restricted ways. The White House, kind of tests you before you go in the bubble. It's not perfect because sometimes you get tested. So, all the other reporters you're traveling with are coronavirus free, but suddenly they put you inside an indoor rally with 6,000 people, right? And that's not so safe, but we're kind of like everyone making decisions on the fly, but on the whole erring on the side of caution because we have responsibility not just to ourselves, but to this larger pool of people.
So do you think that the day will come where you're going to get thrown into having to go to a rally?
In what, like if I raise my hand, I could go tomorrow.
Right.
It's just a question of like if and when I do that.
So if you can't go, are you doing reporting from the same stuff that we're watching on TV, or do you get access to something that we don't get?
No, I mean, it's sort of what Fleg was saying. You miss that on the ground reporting, right? Which was very helpful for me covering Trump in 2016 as one of the few reporters from the Times who actually went to Trump events. I was one of the few reporters at the Times who knew that. Don't roll your eyes at me, Matt. I was one of the few reporters at the Times who knew that Trump might win, right? So there is like incredible value of like being there in the event, talking to voters, feeling the energy or the lack of energy than watching it on a live stream. So I'm not doing that type of reporting. And like there are people at the Post, the Times, the Journal who are, but it is so much more winnowed down and it is so much more challenging. But most of what I do is not just like writing verbatim off of what he said in a rally, right? It's kind of so the reporting has changed, but because the story has changed. So it's getting inside of the COVID response and trying to report out like, why do the hospitals not have the PPE they need? Or how is the president going to make this decision about the Supreme Court? Or why did he imply Ilhan Omar is not from our country? And that is sort of, you don't need to be on the ground for that, but you do need to be on the ground for stuff. And because I'm not on the ground, I'm not doing that sort of reporting.
Okay. How about Rebecca? How about you or Jess? What's COVID been like for you and your jobs? Rebecca, you go first.
Yeah, I think it's amazing that I haven't already gotten coronavirus, given the number of people that I've been in contact with. Like I guess, again, because of the nature of my job, have had to work in person a lot. And this is not a COVID like nightmare, but I will share like a funny story that I'm not sure if I should share, but very early on, the first 3 cases in the DC area, they were in the jurisdiction that I cover. And there was news that there was an associated outbreak in a nursing home. And this was really, really early on in March. And people didn't really know that much about coronavirus, I think, in the US still. There wasn't a sense of how infectious it was. So I found myself wearing like leather gloves and like in a car on the way to the nursing home, like, find out more, what's happening. I was like maybe 5 minutes away from the nursing home. thank God, I get a call from my editor saying like, what was I thinking? Turn around, like don't do this, like come back to the office, we'll do like some phone stuff. And from that point on to like sort of how we think about coronavirus today, I think very different. But from pandemic response to protests and now the election, I've had to go out like quite regularly. I'm incredibly surprised that after like going to protests for like 2 weeks straight and having people like breathe at me or like yell at me like in my face that I have been coronavirus free. All of us actually who covered the protests in DC.
So you're covering the protests and all that stuff, right?
Yeah, so I think the local politics and government team has sort of become like the catch-all for like, because everything will require some kind of governmental response, right? So we've become the catch-all for like everything errant in 2020, which is a lot, I guess. So I was gonna say one of the major ways that coronavirus or the pandemic has affected my job, it's the pace has just been incredibly fast. Like the vacation I'm about to take starting.
Wait, it's faster. It's faster because of the coronavirus?
Yes, and it's very hard to keep up with because there's so much news, I think, on a local level that you want to provide to readers, like what's locked down, how many, in the initial stages, we were tracking every single coronavirus case in the DC metro area on a little spreadsheet that I had, who they were, what we knew about them, where they got the virus from, right? And that slowly became unsustainable as it went to like thousands and thousands and now 200,000 cases. But we were trying our best, right? Like people have obviously been very afraid this past year, and there's like quite a lot of, I guess, like service journalism that we're trying to do, in terms of what you need to know to stay safe, what's locked down, are your government officials responding well to the coronavirus pandemic, and so for me, really, the pace has been nonstop, even for someone was like a recent intern and like very willing and open to like working 15 hours a day and like not eating, whatever it is. It still has been a lot. But
are they sending the young people out into the dangerous jobs because the older people won't do them?
not that older people won't do them. I think our protest coverage in DC, for example, was like a mix.
This analogy.
Hey, you're an older person now, Ashley. That's how long we've been giving out this award.
I will say that like our protest coverage, like most days it was like 8 young women and then like 2 older like veteran journalists who like really want to be part of the action. But it tended to be the younger folks who volunteered, and we were fine. I think mostly because you had to, walk like 30,000 steps a day, and I had to stretch every morning to like get back together. But yeah, so I think the pace has been the biggest shift for me. But at the same time, I will say the good thing that's come out from coronavirus is, at least in the local government and politics pod, and I know that this is not true of all desks, but we've actually become more not united, but more bonded than we were before, I think, actually, because of the pure like necessity and mandate of having to work together to either break stories or cover sort of the regional impact of the virus, So I've gotten to know a lot of my colleagues a lot better, and there's been this sense with the virus and then with the protests and now the election that there's really like a reader service that we have to provide, and in that way I think it's actually been great for a young reporter. It's been an incredibly like inspiring year to be.
That's really interesting. I mean, in a way, what you're saying is that the local stories are national stories, whereas before local stories in different newspapers didn't really make it nationally. Now every local bar where there's a COVID outbreak or something is a national story. So there are very few local stories that are actually local.
Yeah, we were like making that shift, I think, before. Long before the pandemic, long before 2019, right? There was a mandate to try to make make the local stories and make local stories have like a national or at least regional impact. But
Gotcha.
That's been especially true this year. Ashley and I worked on one story together.
And you sent me a feed, right, from the field.
Yeah, so it was the day of the Trump administration, the federal government releasing tear gas and other sort of things at protesters, and I sent Ashley a TikTok of what had happened from the curbside.
Cool. Jess, what about you? How's COVID affected life in the magazine business?
It's been very difficult. So it's interesting because obviously all these folks work on extreme breaking news, and I do too in my job as an op-ed editor, but the magazine industry is not built on breaking news. And creating a magazine, you have to be thinking 6, 5, 4 months in advance. And so the real moment for us came in March when we were working on our June issue. We really decided, I think we decided like the week after everything kind of shut down in New York, maybe that was like the March 13th-ish week, we decided to basically completely scrap our June issue and start from scratch, and create an issue that really spoke to the time that we thought we might be in. And so for reference, the June issue would come out in the beginning of May. And we basically had to forecast what we thought the world was going to be looking like in the beginning of May and what our readers might be needing at that point. And so it was really, we basically threw out an entire magazine issue and started writing like, you know, how do you take care of yourself in quarantine? Like, what kind of mental health resources do you need? Like, it was everything from the kind of, you know, viral moments that we saw in the early pandemic of like making your sourdough starter to, you know, stories from the front lines of young women and young femmes who were working in hospitals and nursing homes and losing their loved ones to COVID. So we really had to try to act like breaking news reporters while working on a really long lead time frame. And then we basically did that again as soon as the George Floyd protests broke out in June. We basically scrapped our entire July-August issue and booked a new cover star who could speak more clearly to the time that we were living through, did a whole new feature package on the protests and speaking to young Black activists. And really just had to pivot completely in a way that I felt was really strong for the brand, but extremely difficult when you're working to book celebrities, do photo shoots, find hair and makeup artists that can all work under COVID restrictions, you know, where they were. It was so funny, you know, talking to the folks who were booking the celebrities and getting these extremely high-res photos and, you know, creating original photo shoots. Like, they ended up choosing people who had access to photographers like in their family or like hair and makeup folks in their family, and just all of these kind of behind the scenes production moments that you would never think about in normal times, but are now just part of our everyday, how do you make a magazine in COVID times? So it's wild. Yeah. Who
got bumped off the cover?
I'm not going to say, but they were replaced with Keke Palmer, which she was incredible. And that came out really great.
Excellent answer. Excellent.
Get a call from Cosmo PR like booting me off.
Yeah, I thought that would be a text to you right when the question came out of my mouth. So normally at this event, we let each of you talk a little bit about how you got to where you are. So we didn't start with that this time. So I'm going to suggest that you do it a little faster than you normally do. But I'm also going to suggest that you think about what happened to you in your career, how possible it is now, like how you're feeling somebody who wants to do what you're doing. I mean, Rebecca, you did this 9 minutes ago, but for the rest of people, if you can handicap it a bit based on what we're seeing now and what you think it's going to be for the next generation. I mean, obviously we know, and it's not a big surprise, a lot of our students either lost internships that were supposed to start in May, or they got bumped. So I think that when it's all said and done, we will probably find that a good part of a year of journalistic internships either became completely different, were done from home, or many of them just poof, disappeared. But what I think we expect, if, you know, please Dr. Fauci, that there is a reason to be going into the next round of internships, and that by the spring, summer of next year, you know, journalism will look a little bit more like it looked before COVID, unless you think it won't. And if so, maybe we need to be learning more home-based reporting techniques too. So why don't we go around the room? Let's start with Ashley. Why don't you tell us the story of your, of how you got started and how you moved up in journalism?
Sure. I will try to be super quick. I started at the Times as Maureen Dowd's research assistant. I did that for 5 years, which is too long to be an assistant. That's my first bit of advice. But she was an amazing boss and a wonderful mentor. And if I had to do it for 5 years, I would have wanted to do it for Maureen.
But just to make sure, you took a lot of nonfiction writing classes at Penn, worked at the DP.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. So I worked at the DP. I was an editor at the DP, the feature assignment and features editor. I wrote for DP 34th Street. I was the features editor for 34th Street. And I was an English and comms major, but with a focus in creative writing. And I took a lot of creative writing classes of the nonfiction variety. And it just felt like right when I graduated, the program was getting even better, right? And you could have really made like a whole major out of it. And I wish I had taken more, not just nonfiction, but fiction and poetry and screenwriting and sort of all forms of writing that I would love to do and could have experienced in college. So I'm Maureen Dowd's research assistant. I then kind of like get hired as like the lowest level reporter you can possibly be at the Times and worked my way up from there. So I was a general assignment reporter on the Metro desk. Then I covered Mitt Romney's campaign, basically living out of a suitcase for a year and a half. Then I covered Congress. Then I covered Jeb Bush's campaign. Actually, Fleg and I both covered Jeb Bush's campaign, kind of like a baton. As he plummeted, Fleg handed the baton to me. And then when Jeb Bush dropped out, I got put on. But it was actually a wonderful time to cover Jeb Bush, to be fair. Yeah, there's something just like so like dramatic and the pathos of the end of this like great American dynasty. I loved it. And then I covered Donald Trump. I was like hungover the next morning in my hotel room in South Carolina the day after Jeb dropped out. And I got a call and was like, in 2 days, we want you out on the campaign trail with Donald Trump. So I covered Trump after the election. So I covered Trump through the election with the Times. The election ended, and I basically moved to the Post the first day of January. So I've been at the Post ever since Trump has been president, where I covered Trump. And I think, I mean, who knows what to predict in COVID, but I will say sort of like, I think some of the hallmarks of my journalism trajectory are the same as always, which is like, no matter what it is in its own way, journalism always feels like a pretty grim field that's about to implode, but never quite does, right? Like I was working for Maureen in 2008 when the recession happened and thinking about trying to get hired as a reporter then. So I feel like tales of our demise are always overstated, but like not totally. And the thing that really helped was I feel like I was just willing to work really, really, really hard, right? Like you do that when you're an assistant. I basically just always said yes to any assignment, to any task. If an editor wanted me to work like a night or a weekend. And like, especially when you're younger, you get all the shit assignments, right? It's like, we just realized that like Bill Clinton is doing a trajectory around Maryland that will require like 27 hours of driving in just one full day. Like Ashley, right? Because like no actual human wants to do that. And I was always just like, yes, I'm there, right? Like I was like, Matt, I could barely even drive, but I was like, I'm doing it. And so I feel like all of those hallmarks, just like always saying yes and working hard are the things that like helped me kind of advance, and also knowing when it's time to leave a place and move somewhere else. And I think those are the things that will kind of serve anyone coming out of college, school now, is being persistent and working hard and kind of overcoming the fact that maybe your internship got canceled, right? And maybe it's even harder to get sourced because you have to do it over the phone and you can't meet in person, but those same kind of traits are the key ones.
How do you think persistence works when you're working from home or not in a full newsroom setting?
I mean, in what way? Like in terms of pitching yourself or like dealing with a source?
Well, even in terms of just letting people know that you're up for anything. I mean, there's a certain aspect of being in a newsroom that a lot of people, if almost nobody, has right now. So
there is like an amazing serendipity. I mean, some assignments are just like literally, like something happens, like Gabby Giffords is shot, right? And no one's expecting that. No one has game planned for that. And an editor like walks out around the newsroom and it's like, you get on a plane to Arizona, right? And then you end up on what may be the biggest story of your life. And so, yes, that element is gone. But I do think that like the editor's looking for two things. They're looking for able bodies, certainly. And that's kind of the serendipity of like you at your desk, right? And, but they're also looking for people who they know, like are going to work hard, are going to be clean writers, are going to file on time, on deadline, are going to like, if you're trying to track down witnesses, are going to call every witness and then show up at every witness's door and knock on the door and then come back the next morning, and so you can still, that sort of like persistence can establish you. But I do think maybe it makes sense I don't really know, because as a White House reporter, there's no dearth of news. And if anything, I feel like I have the opposite problem. But I will say, it's never a bad time to to check in with your editor, especially if you're in an internship or whatever, just flagging, I'm free today. Is there anything anyone needs help on? I'm happy, if you're comfortable, right? I'm happy to go out to a protest and send a feed. Ruth Bader Ginsburg just died. I live near the court. I can walk up to the court. Let me bike to the court, send you some scene. I'll be eyes on the ground. Just all that sort of stuff. And briefly, when I was applying to be Maureen's assistant, they were the process to hire someone dragged out over 3 months, right? And so every single week I had to find an excuse to email her then current assistant in a non-annoying way, I hoped, but to stay on their radar. And she told me when I got hired, the assistant was it was honestly because you were persistent. And when it came time to finally hire someone, your name and your resume were at the top of my inbox. And literally I started in her office, and at one point I was cleaning up, and there was the resume of someone I found out later applied for the job was stuffed down, the former assistant's desk behind, in a little crevice, with coffee spilled on it. And I think just because my resume probably got stuffed down too, but because I emailed every week, that helped.
That's great. By the way, whoever's got their Outlook on, can you turn it off while we're on here? Because that's what that noise is we keep hearing.
Oh, that's me. Sorry.
That's okay. And I heard somebody was taking a bath, it sounded like earlier, but I think that's over. Or doing the dishes. I don't know. Are you at the sink, Ashley?
No.
Matt, why don't you take us through your career trajectory? And remember, start where the people are at Penn who are listening to us tonight.
So I wrote for the DP on sports for freshman and sophomore year. I wrote less after that. Took the nonfiction classes that you take. Pullman, Paul Hendrickson, Dan Rubin, Avery Rome, among others. I was an econ major for reasons that escape me now, but that was the choice I made at some point in the late 2000s, and wound up with internships at the Inquirer after my sophomore and junior year, an internship at the Times after graduation, and I think somewhat similar to Ashley, just sort of stuck around. It was a 10-week program on the Metro desk in the summer of 2011. I just kind of kept showing up, and they told me that was okay. My ID kept working, and I showed up in the building and grabbed assignments. I have a vivid memory of that summer where Ashley and I were out in Anthony Weiner's district for the first of his 3 sexting scandals to date. And talking to constituents as he was dropping out or as he was resigning his seat in Congress. It was that kind of sort of breaking news story that you get thrown on as an intern to, be legs and send a feed from the scene and all of that. A lot of blood and guts, crime stuff on the Metro desk, a lot of breaking news. There was some kind of earthquake that summer that hit New York. There was just any kind of wild Metro story that you can have. And did enough in that space that they kept me on, as Ashley alluded to, in sort of the lowest rung of reporter that you can be, which at that time for me was a stint on the night rewrite desk, which may or may not exist anymore.
Well, there's no night anymore.
There's no night anymore, and there's no newsroom anymore either. But it used to be that from hours it was Wednesday to Sunday, 5 p.m. to 1 a.m. And if anything happened on any desk, I was sort of anchored to a computer and would take feeds from around the world and would write about it. And if nothing happened, it was not a fun 8 hours. And I sort of wrote during the day for Metro and tried to do as much as I could, kind of pitching to other desks in that time. But that was the first sort of proper beat that I had. And I went back to Metro, covered transportation, City Hall, went on to the presidential campaign in 2016, had a lovely stint with Jeb Bush before Ashley got to enjoy the death rattle of the Bush dynasty, and then Ted Cruz, and then Hillary Clinton, all the people Trump beat. And moved to Washington after that, covered Congress briefly in 2017, did kind of a roving political features beat that has more or less persisted since then. I came back to New York, where the politics team is based through some sort of anachronistic DC, New York push-pull with the New York Times over the years. And for the midterms and the presidential, I've been out of New York in this kind of roving, longer form political beat, which has been very strange in these last several months. And I think that just about covers it.
So I would note to for both of you guys, Ashley mentioned it with her working as an assistant, but Matt also stayed at the Times waiting to get a full-time job from his internship, and if I remember correctly, turned down a job at the Post and another job because he wanted to be at the Times. And so I think that those stories are interesting because it's, there's a lot of, I think the culture of younger people is always like moving around a lot because if you do something good for 2 seconds, somebody else wants you. And I know from the student at journalism school, it's very tempting. And the minute people get a job, they're like, they want to know where they're going to go next. So I think both of you, a hallmark of your careers is that you stuck out jobs because you knew where you wanted to be. And I would say, neither of you will say this, but I think both of you are where you are partly because you both wrote stories that were engaging. And I think you were strong writers. You wrote stories with strong reported, but also more not feature-y leads, but leads that were accessible. Okay, so there are people who report, especially on politics, only for people who read politics stories. And there are people who write stories because they're good, that start like good stories. And I think both of you always did that. And I think that as well as everything else is part of why you are where you are. So a lot of times I think DP reporters think they're supposed to write boring stories because that's what a news story looks like. But both of you guys, when you were undergrads, I think it was also that way. You were trying to write stories that were going to connect to people who maybe didn't care about the subject but should. And that's something to think about. So Jess, why don't you talk about the magazine business, and I'll also talk about the book business.
Yeah, totally. So when I was an undergrad at Penn, I was a creative writing major. I took a lot of nonfiction classes, but I also took a bunch of fiction classes too. They Wish They Were Us, which, thank you, Steve, for showing the cover. That book actually originated in a YA fiction writing class that I took during my junior year. So it's really nice to come full
You're
circle.
giving a percentage of your profits back to the department, right? That's
I know. Yeah, I gotta donate. And I was the editor-in-chief of 34th Street my senior year at Penn. And after school, I went to Columbia for grad school. I did their journalism program. I had a couple of internships. Also, I did the Real Arts internship at Rolling Stone in between my junior and senior year. And I did an internship at the Village Voice when I was in grad school, and an internship at New York Magazine also. Then straight from grad school, I got a fellowship at HuffPost, and I worked there on the entertainment beat for about 2 years, where then after I followed my editor to Entertainment Weekly, worked there for a couple of years, and then decided I wanted to make the switch out of entertainment journalism, and applied for a bunch of jobs at various magazines and publications, and ended up at Cosmo as a senior editor doing lifestyle stuff. And when I worked solely on the magazine for about a year and a half. And then when the website and the magazine merged, I took over a lot of lifestyle content on the website, and then have been doing this kind of op-ed personal essay beat since October of last year. So that's like the fun journalism course. And then the book course kind of started during the end of my tenure at Entertainment Weekly. I really was looking for a creative outlet that was not journalism. I was just feeling very burned out in my day job, and just wanted to experience something else. And so I picked up that manuscript that I had started back at Penn, and worked on it really hard for about 2 years until I decided to query agents and find an agent. Started working with an agent in 2018.
How did you get an agent? How did you make that transition? I see it's one of the questions coming up from the audience.
Yeah, great question. So it's really different for fiction and nonfiction. So I can't really speak to the nonfiction side of things, but for fiction, if you're kind of an unknown writer in that space, you really need to write the whole book. There's like really no way around it. You just got to write the whole book. get it to be as great and strong and as good as you can. And then you basically do a ton of research and look up agents and talk to people who are in the field who have agents. My one best tip for finding an agent is to look in the back of books that you love and see who the author thanked. And it's usually like the first or second person is their agent. So that's kind of what I did. I just looked at the books that I loved and the books that I thought that were similar to mine. I came up with a list of maybe like 15 to 20 agents, and I queried them, which is basically just sending them a brief pitch email about you and the book. And I connected with an agent in like May of 2018. And then she and I edited the book together.
That happened quickly, or did you have turn downs?
I had so many rejections, like tons and
So
tons.
it was the same life-sucking process that all querying is, just so that people understand. At every age, querying is a life-sucking process.
Terrible. It's terrible. It's like if you think you get ghosted applying for journalism jobs, just like query agents and you'll be like, oh, it's nothing. But yeah, and so then we sold my book about 6 months later in October of 2018, and it just came out this summer, which is great and crazy. So yeah, long and winding journey. But to answer your question about, advice or different pathways that I think, you can see from my trajectory is, after I graduated grad school, like HuffPost was not the place I wanted to work. I did not think it was like the most prestigious place. I didn't really love the content that was coming out of the entertainment space there. And keep in mind, HuffPost is very different now than it was when I started working there. To me, it was like a real, like, kind of content farmy kind of place. And I didn't see that as the place that I wanted to start my career. But I ended up really loving the internship, and it ended up sending me on this like incredible path, I think. So my advice would be to, like, even if you don't think that you want to work at a place, or even if you think that, you'd rather work at like a more prestigious place, like sometimes working at a place where they give young people a lot of room to grow and a lot of stories to cover, you actually get the most incredible opportunities. For example, like my second year there, I profiled Stevie Nicks. Like, I would never be able to do that if I was like a 23, 24-year-old at Rolling Stone. And now I have that clip in my arsenal. And I was just able to do so much more and just have so much more freedom than if I were at, a place that was maybe more established or took themselves more seriously.
Okay, good. Rebecca?
As Steve said, I graduated 2 seconds ago. I graduated in 2019.
But when you were an undergrad, if I remember correctly, you put a lot of your time into the DP.
Yes.
You were like 24/7 DP, and if I remember, maybe even summers, and you didn't have. I mean, the Post was your first outside.
No, Vox was
job, right?
Vox was my first. Vox.com was my first journalism internship here, but I did spend a lot of time at the DP. If you've been, trying to figure out my accent, it's because I was born and raised in Asia, in Singapore specifically, and I didn't know anyone, any adults who work in journalism growing up. So I came to school in the US, like specifically to figure out, who these people were that I was seeing on the news and try to be a little bit more like them. But that was one of the main reasons I spent a lot of time at the DP. I think I was just looking for role models and sort of people that I could follow into the industry. A lot of them are in the Zoom right now. So at Penn, that's mostly what I did. I ended up being the executive editor of the 134. Spent a lot of time there. While I was at the DP, I got an internship to go work for Vox.com, working for a former DP alum, Yohi Drazen, who was then the foreign editor at Vox. He's since left, I think. That was my first time in DC, my first time in like a big, interesting newsroom, I think. And it was, sort of a turning point for me. I really, really loved it. I fell in love with Slack. I'm a Slack evangelist. I brought Slack back to the DP. And I'm sure people hate me for it now. But after Vox, I went on to apply for an internship at the Washington Post on the foreign desk. Spent 3 months there. Very much loved it as well. Told the editor I would love one day to be a correspondent, which is sort of my far-term goal. I'm not super sure, but he said, all right, my advice to you is to become a local reporter first, because, and I think this is what a lot of like old timey editors like to say, which is, get the skills that you need to be a foreign correspondent, right? And one of the best ways you can do that is really by beating the ground and really sharpening your reporting and your writing skills and filing a lot of copy, which is what I strive to do. So I came back to the Post after graduation on the local desk, initially as an intern, and then did what I heard, people like Matt and Louise did at the Times, and just like hung on for dear life, basically. And eventually got hired in November of last year. And during my internship, I wouldn't say that this was sort of like a turning moment, but I guess speaking to what, Matt and Ashley and Jess have said about me taking all the assignments possible, there was this, as an intern and as a young person generally, in news, you work a lot of weekends. You work most of your weekends. So I happened to be working with a bunch of other interns middle of July, I think, August, in the summer, basically. A lot of people were away. And we were working the weekend of the day in El Paso shooting. So El Paso happened first that Saturday, and our schedule was on Sunday. We got the note from an editor saying like, hey, the shooting has happened. We're probably going to need you to write victim profiles and chase a bunch of leads on Sunday. I was like, all right. Went to sleep. The moment I wake up the next morning, then it happened. So we went into the office. It was genuinely like a bunch of interns. There were some reporters on staff. There were some reporters who were chasing, important stories and things like that. But there were a lot of reporting relied on interns. And there were two interns at the time, me and the Hannahs, I'll call them. Both of them are called Hannah. We just sort of threw ourselves into it, because even though none of us obviously had covered really a mass shooting before, none of us had much experience talking to, grieving parents or siblings of folks who had died hours before. But we tried our best to sort of do what we'd seen, professionals do. And we worked the entire week sort of nonstop on this, and it was exhausting and draining. And the three of us are like bonded in blood by that experience, really, because, we were just out of college. We were kids, basically, on some level. And then from that point on, I think we really continued working hard, but our names as well from that coverage, I think, stuck with our editors, right? Because we were contributing to this big project, of this big effort to cover a huge tragedy. And that's, I guess, sort of my advice, also, as well as to try your best with whatever you're given.
So I'm curious, so you're a year out, and you've seen the people who got your job this year, some of them didn't get to come to the Post.
Correct, yeah.
Because the Post didn't take some of those interns. So
yes, yeah.
What is your advice to Rebecca Tan graduating in 2021 or 22 as the world's a little different?
Yeah, I feel like the class of 2019, we were completely unremarkable, except for the fact that we were the luckiest class in the world to get to experience sort of normal college. But it's very hard. I have tried my best to talk to people coming up and who are very worried and give whatever advice I can, but I'm not sure necessarily that I have the answers. I think do all the same things that people have been saying, when you're applying to something, see if you can connect to someone at the publication or an editor there. If you don't, just cold email the editor and see if they'll talk to you. I think again, for me, the reason why I'm so attached to the DP is I think it really gave me this incredible infrastructure of people to know within the industry, and that's problematic in some ways if you're thinking about pipelines and whatever, but for you personally, it's I would make use of it. Even if you're just a cub reporter or an editor at the DPA, I would try to make use of this as a resource and try to talk to folks even while you're applying, or especially if you're applying. I give sort of a lowdown on how to apply for the Post internship. When folks call me, that I probably shouldn't share here because it goes into who you should try to impress and stuff like that. But I guess the short answer is make use of the DP and the resources that you have available to you. But I also don't know. I don't have the answer.
Okay. Two things I want to point out from what you guys both said. One, I will note that Jess was the first Nora Prize winner first person we gave the Nora Prize to who was going to go to graduate school. And at the time when we started the Nora Prize, we thought it was for people who weren't going to go to grad school, to encourage them if they didn't need to go to grad school. But we realized that a certain percentage of Penn students were going to want to go to journalism school, and we didn't want them to be left out. Rebecca is the first international student that we've given the Nora Prize to, and we certainly, when we started this, thought we probably wouldn't, because in fact, in some cases, it is harder for international students to get jobs than American students, but it is not impossible. And what we want to make sure is people understand is just because things are hard doesn't mean they're impossible. I mean, getting any of these jobs is hard for anybody. So we don't want people to put artificial impediments in front of people. And while most of you guys had pretty big DP or 34th Street careers, it is also possible for students who get interested in nonfiction writing in their junior or even at the beginning of their senior years to catch up and be able to get jobs if they really are committed to doing it and really committed to throwing themselves in. One of the finalists for the Nora Prize this year, Sophie Burkholder, who has been working with me as an intern too, basically started in her senior year, ended up working at the Inquirer. She just finished a semester at the summer semester at the Inquirer. So I want people to understand that there are people who do this all the time at Penn. There are some people who get the urge when they're freshmen or sophomores or juniors. Some people figure it out when they're seniors, and part of the mentorship process for us is to make sure that people who are interested in this, who really are committed to it, get the resources that they need. And you can take a bunch of courses your last year. You can do some catching up. And it's not something where you could say, like, well, if I didn't start at the DP as a freshman, there's no point. That's my spiel. So let's get to some questions. Here's a really good one to start with that I would love to hear all of you say. Do you ever get over the anxiety, stress, awkwardness of interviewing people on the streets, or just people that you haven't scheduled an interview with? I know it's essential, but it is still hard for me. So how do you get over the stress of interviewing people?
That's a good one.
It's definitely hard when you're starting out. Like I commend you for asking that, because it's super difficult. But I think that, like with most things, it's kind of like practice makes it go away. And also the urgency of your editor being like, I need this quote immediately. And like, you kind of fear your editor more than you fear the person on the street that you're trying to get a quote from. Obviously, it's a little different when you're working with like very sensitive issues, but for just like man on the street stuff, I think it's like you're fearing your editor more.
Anybody else have a thought? Have you guys all had fear of interviewing in your lives? Do you still have it?
One of my formative DP experiences, 2016, I was a freshman, sophomore, and my editor at the time told me after the election, obviously, my editor at the time told me to go talk to Pendems who, like, obviously were on the streets, like, weeping their eyes out. And they were not interested in talking to me whatsoever. You know, they said I was horrible for asking questions and things like that. And that was, you know, scary for me at the time, very much so. But I knew I was sort of propelled by the sense that there was a job to do, and I think that's sort of what you should try to keep in focus. And like now, it really just, the anxiety does go away after time. Like honestly, like just if you talk to like 2,000 people, you know, eventually you'll stop.
And I'll echo Jess briefly. Like Maureen would always tell people I was so fearless, but it was actually I was just like terrified of her and like coming back and disappointing her without the quotes or the voices she had asked for and was looking for. For me, I think it's not anxiety, but some of the toughest interviews are the ones where like it's a grieving parent who's lost a child or something where you feel like human decency is to not intrude on them. So I think, so that I kind of try to remind myself, it's a fine line. And I'm not arguing that like, you're a journalist and you need to like hide in the bushes and like jump, you know what I mean? But like, I do think I kind of keep in the back of my mind, like people often want to tell their own story. Everybody has a story and everybody has a perspective and they want to communicate that. And like, if someone wants to say no to you, like they can do that and you can be polite and respectful, but you shouldn't cut that choice off for them. They might want to tell you the story of their son and daughter. They might want to tell you their own story of struggling with COVID, right? And in some ways I don't want to say like what we're doing is so noble and you're helping them, but like people have a story they may want to tell and you can help them tell it. And that's what kind of helps me like deal with the awkwardness and discomfort of approaching someone who you often feel like they don't want to be approached. And again, you may be totally wrong and they don't want to be approached, and then they will tell you and you should be respectful and leave. But I think those are the toughest situations, and that kind of helps me do that.
And you also never, at least in my experience, I've never regretted having a door slammed in my face. I've definitely regretted not knocking on it, right? Or the proverbial door. You always would rather have the answer of whether this person would talk to you than the question of if they would have.
And it actually is amazing the times when you're tested, and it's like, it is uncomfortable. I remember being in Texas once for Glamour, covering women who had all lost their husbands in the Iraq War. And I'd been with them for a week, and I was really drained, and it was really hard, and their lives were really hard. And I was about to leave, and I actually left, and I was out in the parking lot, and I called my wife, and she said, "What the hell are you doing? Get back in there and talk to them more." Because they had all left dinner and they went to this bar and they were dancing. And she said, "You should be there. You should be there to talk to them and be there." And so I went back in, and actually the best quotes in the story when I had been there with them for a week came from that half an hour when I went back into the bar. So I think, one, you should always be afraid of what you're going to miss. And two, you're there to engage. So, and the other thing is, if you think that fear is going to go away, I mean, there's nothing I hate more than calling somebody I don't know. That is never going to change. It was true the first time I did it. It's true now. But I also am fascinated that you get through it, and that same person that you didn't want to contact ends up being somebody who's a source that you use a lot. Now, I'm curious at the same time, this question was asked about sort of man on the street, and obviously this has been a summer and fall of man on the street stories with all the protests. But for those of you who are, in Jess's situation, talking with top celebs, and for Ashley and Matt talking to the top political candidates, I'm curious what that is like for you, and especially with such a confrontational president. I assume, especially Ashley, that you've been dressed down like everybody else and put into these situations. So I'm kind of curious what that's like. Anybody? Ashley?
Yeah, there's something unique about this president and the way he goes after journalists that took me a little while to adjust to. The first time I was called out, it was I still remember, right? It was a huge rally in San Diego. It was about 10,000 people. It was like a very fiery rally. It was the rally where he said it sounds so quaint now, but Judge Curiel couldn't possibly rule because he has, Mexican heritage. He couldn't rule fairly. And myself, as at the Times, then myself and Maggie Haberman, another reporter, had just posted a story online that he didn't like. And like midway through the rally, he starts talking about this unfair story, and he's like, and there's a woman named Parker and a woman named Haberman, and they're like disgusting and despicable. And like, I was there at the rally. I was in the press pen. The press pen at Trump rallies there's always a press pen that's not unique to Trump, but it's normally at the back of the room. But in Trump, it was, first of all, his rallies were so much larger than anyone else, but B, you're kind of in the center of the room because you're part of the show, right? At some moment, like after you chant "Build the Wall," the crowd will then chant like "CNN sucks." So you're part of the show. I'm in the front row. And someone had actually, this rally very helpfully made laminated name cards with all of our like names. Like it just said Parker on a big computer-sized sheet of paper that was laminated. And so he's like a woman named Parker, and they're not here, are they? And like the entire crowd turns around and is like booing. And I just I'm slowly like sliding my little nameplate like under my laptop and like looking around to see if I can find the horrible Parker woman, and just like kept on typing. And so that was just like unnerving. And then, but luckily, like as a print reporter, like no one actually knows what I look like, right? Like I could have been like, "Over there, that's her," and everyone would just like run. And then once he was in the White House, he would also often like tweet about stories. You'd write a story and he would tweet and say like, "That's not true, that's fake news." And I remember again, it was like 11 a.m. and I was in a liquor store, but only because I was leaving physical therapy and like going to dinner at a friend's house and picking up a bottle of wine on my way to work. But I'm in a liquor store and I realized the president has tweeted about one of my stories to say it's false. And there is still just, even though at this point I knew that Trump lied, right? And I knew that he misstated things, there is still just like like a weird sense of like, oh my God, the president of the United States is saying my story is wrong. Like, did I get something wrong? Did I triple check myself? Like, is it bulletproof? And it turned out it was, and that's happened since. The first time was surreal. And then the final time that's maybe notable was I think Phil Rucker and I, one of my colleagues, we'd done a story called like Trump's lost summer, Trump's squandered summer. In this story, I remember it because this gets back to childcare, but it was like a weekend and my husband had agreed to get up with the baby so I could sleep in. And then around like 7:30, my phone starts buzzing so much, it's like an alarm, but it's just like all these like texts from friends because Trump like tweeted out me by name and called us nasty lightweight reporters, which again, is just like a weird feeling. It's a good way to get in touch and hear from former boyfriends and like blast from the past. I don't know. And I don't respond to that. I don't really engage. I don't think that's helpful. I don't think it's helpful when we become part of the story. But that is something that only happens in this White House and like is always a little like uncomfortable and non-ideal.
Samantha asks, what's the line between personal and professional in interviews? And how do you seem approachable without appearing to be biased or too emotional? Matt, you haven't talked in a bit.
Thank you, Stephen. I'm thinking about that one. I mean, it's the glib answer is the way to be professional is to be professional. But obviously, everyone brings their own biases to every interaction they're ever going to have. This sort of idea of perfect objectivity and voice of God neutrality doesn't make a whole lot of sense when you're dealing with human beings, but sort of basic fairness and giving people a fair hearing and sussing out the relative merits of what they're saying is sort of all any source can ask for, at least in my view. So I think going into any interaction with that mindset is important. I guess is the implication of the question that sort of implicitly agreeing with the perspective of somebody to draw out more information might be unethical, or I mean, there are these sort of.
I got the impression that maybe the question was, how do you talk to somebody who you were biased against, in your personal politics, and also, do you acknowledge that, or do you have a way of not letting that be in the situation?
I personally certainly would not acknowledge that, and have obviously covered very ideologically disparate people on every side. This is not the same level of vitriol that you might see at a Trump rally that Ashley talked about, but at every Ted Cruz event in Iowa, he would sort of do this recurring bit with the New York Times, because it was a laugh line in his stump speech about like, and there's Matt in the back of the room, and drinks are on him because the New York Times is and that was sort of his winking, I'm a conservative and the New York Times is liberal sort of shtick in the stump speech. And you get a version of that and have to answer for the sins of the editorial page all the time. But in my own interactions with politicians on any side, I hope and expect that they have no idea what my personal politics are.
How about when you're doing analysis stories, or you're actually trying to bring something besides straight reporting? I mean, both you and Ashley are doing more analysis, and I guess you do some on TV as well, Ashley. Is it different when you're not just saying this is what I reported, but you are raising a question about campaign strategy, or a question about, or trying to paint a portrait of somebody in a bigger way, which I think that Ashley, you've had to do with Trump a couple times this year. I mean, these go beyond just the reporting. They are, they're also think pieces. So do you have to keep your politics out of those too? And if so, how do you do it?
I mean, I think one thing that's gotten a little tricky under Trump that we kind of have to remember is like, there's some things that are just objective truth, and you're not being biased if you describe it for what it is. And I've kind of had to train myself in that. But if the president says something that is racist, like, you're not biased for noting that he said something racist. He said something racist. You watched it and you can fairly and accurately report that to your readers. Same with something anti-Semitic, same with something sexist or misogynistic, same with something offensive or otherwise problematic. And it took, and you know, it's tricky because he's sort of so brazen sometimes in the stuff he says that, but I think that's one thing we've learned is like, you can call a lie, and lies are actually a little trickier because I think lie, if you look it up, it like involves intent, right? Like they have to know, the person who's lying has to be like deliberately trying to mislead the public. And for instance, Trump has said that he passed VA choice over 138 times, as it turns out. That was passed in 2014 under Obama. But if Trump himself at this point actually believes that he signed that into law as the host of The Apprentice, is that a lie or is that simply a mistruth, right? So you do kind of grapple with that stuff in the margins. But I do think, I don't know, I think you can just like report things that are factual. A little flip side is that in terms of reported stuff where you haven't witnessed it firsthand, there was something very tricky in this administration, especially where they would sort of play the media off of each other, and you could talk to 6 people in a meeting and 2 of them would straight up lie to you. You know, 2 of them would give you like their most favorable spin and 2 of them would tell you the truth, right? And one of the reasons why we and at other publications interview so many people is because in order to understand, for instance, what happened inside a pivotal Oval Office meeting, it's not just like where you could talk to one person, right? You need to kind of create this kaleidoscopic vision and understand everyone who is there and then cross-check it against everyone's different motivations and what you know about everyone. Like, are they a truth teller? I sort of think of sources, some are like Wikipedia, right? Like a good jumping off point, but you would never cite them in a term paper. Like some are like Reddit, like you go down this zany rabbit hole, but like every now and then you come up with a nugget. And in reporting on Trump, you really need this 360 approach.
Here's a question, a different sort. It's from Sophie Burkholder. What do you think about the balance of local and national journalism right now? I think these past several months have shown that large national newsrooms can be detached from local populations. However, opportunities in local journalism are dwindling. I fear this issue will grow worse with the economic hardships of the pandemic. But what do you think a solution could look like?
She's right. I mean, I think in a lot of ways, like so many local papers are not what they used to be in terms of resources and manpower. I can just speak from the Cosmo perspective of a national magazine. Whenever we're doing a regional story or focusing on a specific subgroup or subculture, or even just like reporting on something that's going on the ground right now, like for example, the Louisville protest or the protests that have been going on in Portland, we really only hire reporters who are on the ground in those places. I don't think that makes like a necessarily sustainable freelance career, but as a national magazine and one of the most, lucrative ones these days, even we are cutting back on travel expenses and not always looking to send our own seasoned in-house reporters to those places. And sometimes it just makes more financial sense to look on the ground for local reporters there. So if you're someone who's like, I really want to be a reporter in Baltimore or Portland or Houston or any of these specific places, but there's no media attention, there's no national outlet there or big media outlet there, you might have a shot of being like the go-to freelance reporter for all of these places that don't necessarily have the money to send their own people there. And I think that's great for people in like mid-career positions, not necessarily all, entry-level folks, but in terms of like a bigger look at the industry at large, I think that we might be seeing more of that.
It sounds like you're describing people basically in American cities acting like foreign correspondents, and the way foreign correspondents used to be in foreign cities.
Yeah, basically. And there's so many instances where we go to like our preferred reporter in Dallas and she's like, oh, sorry, I'm working on this for InStyle or Glamour, so it's like, we see this happening a lot in women's media.
Alana asks, what is your advice for finding positions to even apply for during COVID? Like what's a reasonable strategy for somebody who's either a senior right now or a recently graduated senior? You know, how would you go about looking for a job, for freelance relationships? You know, what would you do?
Great question.
I would reach out if you've already had internships. I would reach out to the editors that you worked with before, because even if they don't necessarily have a job for you, they might know someone who does. I think Julia Rubin, who works at the Goods, a couple years ago, like said that she was looking for an entry-level reporter for the Goods, and reached out to me and said if I knew any friends. I was like, I'd love to apply for the job actually, but I was a junior, so I did like reach out to some friends, one of whom later got the job, right? So I would, I think, again, like making use of that network that I talked about earlier, and then reaching out to editors that you've worked with before. And then every year, Pointer publishes it's like the holy grail of like internship listings. It's like 72 internships you can apply to this summer. And I relied on that when I was applying for stuff and got used to a lot of rejection.
Yeah, I also think Twitter is actually a great place for this. Not necessarily just like searching like internship or whatever, but if you, find specific people and editors who always like promote job listings, it's actually like a great place for these listings that don't necessarily get posted on big company websites. And if you're like a person of color or a writer of color, there are specific networks on Twitter, like I think it's just called Writers of Color, or, female writers of color. And they promote internships all the time, for various publications. But yeah, I think it's a lot of networking, like Rebecca was saying, but also knowing certain like weird keywords to search. Like sometimes like fellowship is like a good one, or like, hashtag like journalism jobs. These like kind of secret but not so secret and very obvious like terms on Twitter can sometimes source like random freelance positions that you might never find on like Media Bistro.
Are the big special projects that some of the larger media groups being done all in-house, or are they bringing freelancers in for some of these special sections and video projects? How do they work, and can people connect to them if they don't actually have jobs at the places?
I think it's a little bit of both. I just hired a freelance political correspondent who's going to help me out with political coverage at Cosmo, and that was just a woman who I had worked with previously and really liked. I think that those positions are probably pretty hard to get without any prior experience with the publication, though.
But like at the Times at the Post, there's like some really big video projects and special projects, special sections. Are those all in-house people, or are they combinations of freelancers?
I think it's a combination. I think the sort of setup Rebecca was talking about on protests has been a little bit analogous on the politics side. I think there are obviously national correspondents in various parts of the country, but we've also had a more extended freelance network on some of the political coverage, which wouldn't have necessarily happened in a pre-COVID world where we could just go to those places ourselves more often. But it has sort of changed the map and the landscape for freelance, it does seem like.
Yeah, I will say the Post has something, and this was pre-COVID, called the Talent Network. And it's basically like a list of freelancers around the country in kind of every state. And someone at the Post mentioned that like this is the thing that other publications most want to like buy from the Post, either access to our actual talent network or like the intellectual property behind a talent network. And I don't know, apparently we're not selling it because it's our talent network. But I will say, like, if you are on the ground somewhere, it seems like and again, I don't think this is a way to break into journalism or a full-time career, but if for whatever reason, right, like you are based in Austin, Texas because you love it, or your family's from there and you're freelancing for their Alt Weekly and writing some pieces for the magazine and trying to get hired at the Statesman, it would be kind of worth reaching out to maybe the political editors of the editors of a bunch of publications, the Post, the Time, whoever, just to establish yourself as an on-the-ground freelancer. And there's so many times when we're looking for someone and we're like, oh, let's call, I can't make these 3 flights, let's call the Talent Network. And I will say at the Post, and I assume other publications, like we've all been trying to break into journalism, we've all been freelancers. And so I think whenever we get a feed or we use something from the Talent Network, the reporters and the editors go out of their way to try to give that person a byline, because it sucks standing outside all day in the heat interviewing voters and only one of your quotes gets used. So it can be can get you some clips too.
One of the things that I'll note that we haven't talked much about, but it's important to remember that you have to also be able to do the work. So there's all this stuff about careerism to talk about, but the question is, what is your process to learn how to do interviewing, to write a good story? And also, do you pitch story ideas? I think a lot of times before people have jobs, what they do that impresses editors or would-be employers is that they tell them story ideas that they don't know about, or they didn't realize were breaking a new way. Now, that's not going to be a story idea about President Trump, but like on Rebecca's beat, there could be lots of stories that are unfolding in neighborhoods that somebody would know about and bring to an editor. So I think story ideas are an incredibly important thing, and your ability to actually write the stories even better. I would also note that you develop some of those skills working at the DP. You develop some of them in the nonfiction writing classes, and the networking that you can do through Penn alums and also through the Real Arts project. So people don't always know about Real Arts. I find out way too many seniors who never knew that Real Arts existed. Real Arts is a project that's existed for a number of years at Penn. It involves getting paid internships at publications so that even if those publications don't have any money for interns that summer, you get to go because Penn pays for you. The Daily Pennsylvanian has a program like this as well now. And this is really important. It's important for undergrads. It has become increasingly important for graduating seniors. So we never 10 years ago would have thought of paying for an internship for somebody after they graduate, but now it's becoming much more common. And especially in COVID this year, I will tell you that the people who got jobs this summer, many of them were people that Penn paid their salary because the publication had decided to pull the rug out under paying theirs. So the people who worked at the Inquiry this summer were Real Arts people who had Real Arts money. Someone had a question asking Rebecca if you could speak a little bit more about how international students can get jobs.
It's very hard because of the visa situation. And one of the problems, I think, related to the local national question is that a lot of local newspapers simply don't have the budget and don't have the experience to figure out the visa situation for you, because they have a lot of young, very talented reporters already in the US who are citizens who don't have that problem. It's hard. So I guess sort of the practical advice is, unfortunately, you're probably going to have to aim for a national outlet or a magazine with a little bit more resources if you are in the need of someone to sponsor your visa. The second thing that I would mention is that your perspective is incredibly valuable, even if you think that I started out thinking, especially working in local journalism, that my perspective, or that, my lack of awareness of the US, not growing up here, was going to be a detriment rather than an advantage. And I don't think that that's necessarily true anymore. I think, and this speaks to people who have traditionally been kept out of the journalism as well, particularly, Black and Latino young people. What you bring, especially when it comes to story ideas, story generation, what you understand as a story or as interesting is incredibly valuable, and I wouldn't discount that whatsoever. There was a question earlier too about whether you need to develop a beat or an expertise really early on and just take what you get. And I don't actually think that those are the choices before you. I think you take what you get, but you don't get rid of the things that you're inherently interested in or passionate about. You bring those to your beat, right? So I am covering the DC suburbs, right, which I've never lived in prior to recently, and I didn't know much about until I started the job. But I have long been interested in, immigrant and diaspora communities, of which there are a lot in the DC suburbs, to support the massive structure of DC, or the massive operations of DC. And so that's what I focus, as much of those are where most of my passion projects or sort of enterprise efforts are geared toward. And I think it's part of what let my editors see that I have something different and new to bring to the desk. So the pragmatic piece of advice is unfortunately you have to apply to national outlets, figure out the visa situation fairly quickly. And then the second thing is use your perspective and growing up elsewhere as an advantage rather than see it as a flaw.
And can I just add, sort of to Stephen's point, but also to that, in terms of, I feel like especially in terms of pitching when you're younger, use both, like, you have an advantage by being a young person, right? Like, especially in a newspaper. And I quickly realized that, like, when I worked for Maureen, even if I had a brilliant idea in 2008 about like Obama and foreign policy, right? They'd have been like, okay, kid, go tell it to our foreign policy reporter. But like, I knew the bars where like the Bush girls were hanging out and drinking, right? And, you know, that was kind of interesting. Or I knew like what young Obama kids were doing and what that scene was like. Or I knew that, like, I mean, this sounds really dumb, but I did get a story in the Times about adult kickball. That like my editors wouldn't have even known about. And the other thing is, like, I think for me, and I think there's also an instinct, especially if you get to a place like the Times where it's just like very authoritative and serious and voice of God, but the stuff that I am like most proud of and the stuff that I hear about from the most people is often like the more playful stuff, the more voicey stuff. And don't like feel like you can be yourself and don't feel like you have to fit into this mold of like a very serious journalist. And some of the best pieces, like what's interesting to you will be interesting to other people, right? So like I got a column, I actually wrote it for a nonfiction writing class, but I got it published in William Sapphire's On Language column in the Sunday magazine about my younger sister, like abbreviating all of her words like a moron. But like everyone knows a young person who abbreviates all of their words. And it was like funny and interesting to them. And like two pieces of flags that I remember are not his like trenchant political coverage, although I do remember that, but was one, he went and he tried out as like a ball boy for the US Open, right? And another time it was like the editors had discovered that he was the Times' transportation reporter who didn't know how to ride a bike. And so he went and he took bike riding classes.
That's his best story. Sorry.
Yeah, and learned how to ride a bike.
It's
So
all
like,
been downhill.
yeah, so don't feel like you can't be yourself or you can't be fun or playful. Like that's what readers like. And like really serious journalism is often like really fucking boring. I probably shouldn't say that. It's also really important, but like you can do both.
No, I think, and as you get older, what you're going to find is that the people who stay in this business and like it is because they understand that one of the joys of working at a publication is that you can have a number of things you do regularly, and some of them might be pretty serious, but you also can do stuff that's really playful because you're inside. If you pitch that same story from the outside, maybe you don't get to do it, but you get to do it as an insider. And there are people who develop full second beats. I had a J school student who was hired at the Dallas Morning News to be their environmental writer, only write really serious stuff. On the side, she said, well, you don't have anybody who writes about vegetarian dining. So can I have a vegetarian dining column? And when she left the paper, as many people, if not more, were crushed that her vegetarian dining column was leaving than her award-winning environmental reporting. So I think that part of what's cool about being a journalist in any medium is recognizing that you're going to pick a couple things that you're learning how to do well and developing, but also things that are on the side that are just your passions. And those can develop into your full-time job later in life, or they can always be the thing that you do on the side. And that's how you keep sane when the other stories you're doing are really mind draining, and so that's one of the joys of the job. And I think a number of people have asked this question, and I will run it by you. How do you know if you should do this? So it's a question that we all talk about ourselves. So I'm curious, when you're sitting there senior year, this is true any senior year. So this senior year too, how do you know if you should do this and pursue this?
I think Matt has the answer to this one.
Do I actually?
Yeah.
Okay, so I've probably used this anecdote before here. I think it was an Inquirer person who I spoke to one of the summers I was there, who basically said, if you can see yourself doing anything else in the world, definitely do that and not the journalism. And I couldn't, and I have no other marketable skills, so it was sort of an easy call. But I sort of, in the spirit of that, would say again, like, you really have to want it. It's not that much fun if you're not enjoying the parts of it that are incredibly fun. And the grind of it can be real, and it's not necessarily lucrative, particularly early on. And benefits so outweighed that for me, and have continued to, that it hasn't been a source of great reckoning. But I do think that question sort of hangs over every senior spring semester thought that you might have. And even for as much as I was pretty clear on wanting to do this, I gave in to the like OCR temptation and decided to like do some consulting interviews as a senior. Just
Did?
because,
I had no
Oh my
idea.
God.
I know.
Oh my God.
I'm just impressed
And
you
then
with
I
that
backed out.
acronym.
And yeah, I applied for a few and was like, what am I doing? And withdrew from the interviews. But it's easy to get wrapped up in like not having a
I feel
job.
like that's how I briefly rushed a sorority, but go on.
That sounds much more interesting rather than me going through like BCG casebooks. But yeah, I mean, it tests your will, especially at moments of great industry peril, which, as Ashley alluded to, seems to always kind of be the case, and both is and isn't the case in each of those times. But yeah, again, the joys of it have always outstripped everything else for me.
I will say, on the off chance that there is someone considering a career in consulting and journalism side by side, I would just say that given the year that we've just had, if you happen to be a college student feeling particularly helpless or feeling like you want to be able to do something about everything going on around you, I think journalism is one of the things that's unparalleled in that respect. Like I guess Ashley said, like, don't be afraid. You don't earn a lot of money, but you earn enough. In a job in journalism, you're not gonna be poor or anything like that. You can probably live. So I would, in the hope, in the possibility that we manage to, divert someone from consulting to journalism, like I really hope, like, just don't be afraid, and the really very, very satisfying parts of it, you get to see your impact like so immediately, and it's gratifying, and you feel like you're part of change, right? And it's, yeah, hopefully someone out there puts away the consulting books.
I feel compelled to add that I did this before applying for the Nora Magid Mentorship Prize and being shown the way by my elders.
Sure.
A few disorienting weeks in the fall of 2006, I was a wayward son.
Well, we reeled you in.
Something like that.
Well, that reminds me to put up the prize thing one more time. And if you are a senior, you're interested in the prize, please apply. Here's my email if you need to talk to me about this. And this is a weird year to be a senior, but every senior year is a year when people can connect to journalistic organizations. They can connect to nonfiction writing projects. I mean, I write books, and Penn students often work on my books. I think Jess worked on one of my books once. And there are other faculty members who are working on books that you can learn how to do nonfiction reporting through that as well. Don't be discouraged. And also use the Nora network, use the network of people that come out of Kelly Writer's House. It's part of the reason you parents spent the money for you to go to Penn. Do not be afraid to network. That's why you're here. That's why we do this event, and that's why we have the Nora Prize. So please feel free to reach out to the people on this panel, to other people from the Penn community who are out in the media world. They helped us when we were coming out. That's part of the reason we give back. And so I just want to thank everybody. What's nice about this is because there's no food waiting on the other end, we get to talk longer. So I really, again, want to thank Ashley, Matt, Jessica, and Rebecca for being here with us tonight from all over the world. And also thanks for your great work, because, all the work that you do proves that there's reason for people to keep going into journalism and keep writing and creating things that really make a huge difference. That's why we do this job. So thanks so much to you guys. It's great to see you. And I hope we see you all here again next year. And please check out the Nora Prize, check out the courses in the journalism minor. And if you're interested in nonfiction writing as a career, take the shot. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Stephen.